Hello and welcome to Transformative Principle, episode 19. I am very excited to have you here today. There has been a lot of interest and growth from my interview with George Couros last week after he gave the keynote speech at the USET conference here in Utah. That was an amazing experience, and I was really excited to be able to chat with him and learn from him. I think I could listen to that one a couple more times and probably get something new out of it each time. And thank you so much for your support for this podcast. I am learning a ton, and I hope you are too. I hope if you haven't yet, you'll subscribe in Stitcher Radio or in iTunes, and then share this with all your friends as well. This week, I'm pleased to have Tony Sinanis, the principal of Cantiague Elementary on Long Island, New York, on the podcast this week. He is an awesome principal who also hosts the Brand Ed podcast on the BAM Radio Network, which is a great one that you should listen to. He co-hosts that with Joe Sanfilippo, and that is definitely one of my favorites. Also, he's been on other podcasts before, and he's kind of a big deal, so I'm really grateful that he took the time to chat with me and to help me learn more about him. So I broke this interview up into two different episodes. The first episode is all about how he's just such a humble guy. I mean, it's just amazing. He is so aware of himself and his environment. It's inspiring. I just love listening to him. He talks about a very, I think, appropriate balance of recognizing the cultural differences in the people that he interacts with and how that can be used as an advantage, but also how that prevented him from being the best that he could be. I'll let him tell the rest about it, but I hope you enjoyed this interview with him. He's an awesome principal, and I'm really excited that we got to talk to him. I'd also like to thank our sponsor for this episode, SaneBox, which helps you bring sanity back to your inbox. Click on the link in the show notes and give that program a whirl, which will help you not be interrupted by the annoying emails that you don't want to be. Time to chat with me. I've heard you on a couple podcasts recently, on the PT Chat podcast, yes. And on the Principal Cast podcast. And so I like the things that you're talking about. I'm glad we could finally connect.
Sure. My pleasure.
What I do is I just ask questions, and then you just talk about what you're comfortable with, and we can go for as long as you want. Do you have a time limit that you need to stop at so I can plan for that?
Probably by 12:30 I need to have sort of be wrapped up because I have a 1 o'clock appointment, not in the building. So
okay, that's perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's start first. Tell me about who you are, where you came from, and what you're currently doing.
Sure. So my name is Tony Sinanis. My real name is Anthony Sinanis. No H, not Anthony. Anthony. Okay. But I go by Tony, and so I've kind of morphed that over the last couple of years, where I thought I wanted to go back to Anthony, but the only person that calls me that is my mom, so we're just going to leave it at that. And I am actually the first person in my family to graduate from college, and in so much as both my parents immigrated here from Greece in the mid-1950s. I do have an older brother and sister who are amazing people and do great work. They just didn't happen to go the college route. They went alternative routes. So I'm the first one who went to college, and I love it so much that I just keep going back. I have 2 masters, and now I'm in the middle of my doctoral studies. So,
so you're crazy too.
Good. Yes, I am definitely insane. There's no doubt about that. I think if you're an educator, you have to have some level of insanity.
Yeah.
In a good way. So yeah, my sort of journey in college started out as pre-med, and I was in a 7-year medical program at in a local school here in New York, and just wasn't what I was interested in as the sort of studies unfolded. So I tried about seven different majors. I did everything from theater to psychology to English literature to finally realizing that I wanted to be a teacher as a result of doing this community service tutoring in a local school by my college. And so
Mm.
I enjoyed that so much. It became the highlight of my week. These kids were great. So I transferred though because they didn't have the elementary education degree, which is what I wanted. So I ended up going to NYU about my junior year of college. So I had to do another year of college, which is fine because it
Hmm.
allowed me to pursue all the ed courses and stuff like that. So
And you like
I,
college, so.
I love college in the end. I hated it then, but I love it now. No, no. I ended up, at NYU, which had such a wonderful program, and I had the opportunity to student teach in some really incredible spaces with some really progressive thinkers and both the teachers and the staff and the kids. Sorry. So it was wonderful. It was a really wonderful experience for me. And then in 97, yes, 97, I graduated and I was very fortunate. I got a job right out of college teaching fifth grade in an inner city school here in New York City, in the New York City public school system. I had 37 kids in my first class. Um, about half of them were developing their English skills, and the other half were it was just quite a crew. But I love them so much. They're such a great
Yeah,
group, and I am still in touch with a lot of them. We actually get together often for like breakfast or lunch or whatever, just to
it's
kind of check
awesome.
in. Yeah, not as often as I'd like, but often enough that I know that they're okay, and I know they're pursuing their dreams and passions and interests. So it's really wonderful to connect with them. So I taught in New York City public schools for 3 years, where I primarily taught fourth and fifth grade. And then I transitioned to Long Island, which is a suburb of New York City. I was in Hewlett, which is on the South Shore here, and I taught fifth grade there for 5 years. Um, and in that time, I completed two master's degrees, one being in
Wow.
educational. Yeah, my family was very supportive,
Yeah.
which is great. I did educational technology for one degree, and then I did my second one in educational leadership. And after our son was born, he had some medical issues. He has some medical issues. Most amazing kid, and he's totally changed, my life and our lives. But I was concerned that maybe I wouldn't be able to be as good of a teacher as I was because so much of what I did came from like my heart. I mean, I love my kids, and I,
Hmm.
I, you know, went to their baseball games after school, and I went to their homes when they were sick, and I went to bar mitzvahs when they were, older, and I was very much immersed in their lives beyond the classroom, and that was really important to me to have a sense of who they were. But I had this little boy who needed me more than anyone else, and
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if I could manage it emotionally,
Hmm.
because I'm a bit of a sap. Um, so I thought I should be an administrator because then I won't have a group of kids that I'm responsible for every day. But in fact, I went from having 20 something kids to having about
Exactly.
500.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Exactly.
you clearly immerse yourself in that as well.
Yeah.
So in 2005 or 2006, I think, yeah, 2006, I no 2005, I transitioned into my first administrative position. I was an assistant principal at an elementary school in Valley Stream. It was a K-6 building, and it was great. It was so different than where I was, and the kids were wonderful, and the staff, many. I was only 31 at the time, I think, or 30.
Hmm.
Many of them were older than I was, so it was a bit of a transition for them as well. But they were really supportive and positive, and they taught me a lot, so it was great.
Yeah.
Um, I only did that for 1 year though, because the principal who hired me, who I love, and her name is Pat Burns, and she's now an assistant superintendent in a local district. She taught me so much. She went on to become the assistant superintendent there, so the principalship was available, and everyone thought I was ready. I kind of thought I was ready, and so I went for it. I was not ready. I got the job. But I was not ready. I should have enjoyed being an assistant principal a little longer to learn and not be the place where the buck stops. But I did make the leap, and I worked as hard as I could to make it positive and successful for everyone. But about a year or so in, I realized it just wasn't the right fit. I wasn't the right fit for the community. I didn't have the experience, the skill set that they needed. It was a really wonderful community, but they needed someone different than me. And as much as I felt like a failure on some levels, I also realized my shortcomings and my inexperience and how that would affect the organization, not just me, you know?
Yeah, can I
Um,
stop you for just one sec on
yes,
that? So
yeah,
that's a really fascinating thing, and that's a hard thing for people to admit. I'm not the right fit, or I'm not good enough for this position. Do you mind
yes.
expounding on that a little bit more? How you came to that realization, and what particularly you felt you didn't have the skill set for, and why you have a skill set to be where you're at now. For example, you may have been going that direction, but I want to emphasize that because it's hard for us to admit when we're struggling. So
Sure.
please.
No. Well, one of the things I lacked was intestinal fortitude, and I, and that's a big deal. You know, when you're an educator, and especially I feel like in a leadership position, you can't take things personally. Even though people may come at you from a personal place, they're not. It's not about you, and it's not about them. It's about an issue that they feel really strongly about, or that you feel really strongly about. I wasn't able to get that, and I really poured my heart and soul into that job, which I still do, but I wasn't able to separate Tony the person from Tony the principal and the school as a whole and what that meant. So, uh, to be quite honest, I probably went home crying like 3 or 4 times a week, because I felt like a failure. Like I felt like just when I felt like I was making progress with the kids, let's say, I felt like I was losing ground with our staff, you know, that I was, you know, not attending to their needs enough. And just when I turned my focus to them, and I felt like I was disconnecting from the community, the parents and the families. And it was a very diverse community, predominantly African American and Latino, which was wonderful and enriching for me. But as a young white man who was not really associating, like I never grew up associating myself with whiteness,
Uh-huh.
because my family is Greek. You know, we're Greek, and so the idea of like, I don't know. I never identify myself as white. I am white. I am Caucasian, but my culture and our religion is different. You know, it's different than your, you know, sort of, I don't know,
Right.
whatever. So in that job, though, I started to realize that, in fact, yes, I am white, and that affords me certain privileges, and that affords me certain perceptions, uh, often positive ones. Just because I'm this tall white guy, even height's an issue,
Mm-hmm.
and I started to realize that I didn't have the experiences that my kids needed me to have. Like I didn't grow up with the experiences that they had, and they had really rich sociocultural experiences that they brought to school, right? But those
Right.
are not the things that we tap into in a school. In a school, we tap into standards and test scores and so on and so forth. Where our kids, you know, I had kids who were from the Caribbean. Their life was so different than mine growing up, and yet it was hard to find a space in school to tap into that and
Right.
to maximize that skill set. And so there was a bit of a disconnect, and I didn't have a lot of experience. So so aside from the intestinal fortitude that I lacked, I was also I was more reactive than I was proactive, and that's not good. You can't react to people because they know they can get a reaction out of you, and so
Yeah.
they'll come to you, you know, for that. And even though my reactions I thought were always like in the best interest of everyone else, they didn't give me an opportunity to reflect and to be thoughtful, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
so those are probably the two biggest issues, in addition to the sort of I'll say cultural disconnect, but I was coming from a different space, you know, and my experiences as an educator and as an individual didn't really necessarily prepare me for what this community needed at that time. And they needed someone strong, and they needed someone experienced, and they needed someone who was not going to take things personally. And they needed someone who, and it wasn't about skin color at all, but a little bit it was, in so much as I couldn't necessarily always relate, and people thought that I was even more disconnected because I happened to be very pale in my literal skin color.
Uh-huh.
Um, Yet I grew up in this immigrant household, which was very much like the households that my kids grew up with in that area, but it was different. It was still very different. And perception oftentimes is harder to overcome than the reality, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, the perception of me as this young, inexperienced white guy at the time was hard for some people to overcome, I think, and for some people to see past, and rightfully so, because I was young, I was inexperienced, I am white, so
Yeah.
all those things they were not lies, they were facts, but it definitely was. It made the experience challenging, and you know what? My kids deserve better. My staff deserved someone who was coming from a different perspective. Also, philosophically, there were some differences for me.
Mm-hmm.
So all those things that I just brought up, those are like personal things that I know I could have worked through, and experience would have bridged the gap, and so on and so forth. But the last piece of it was there was a major philosophical chasm between where I was and where the district was, because I was on like my third superintendent in like 2 years, because people retired, interim acting, and um, it was very hard for me to grow. So my inexperience kind of fell on myself, because there was no one there to lead me and to guide me, and the vision kept changing. There was no vision, so it
Yeah.
was a challenge. So
And
that's what happened.
you said some really amazing things in there that we sometimes think, well, I care about my students who are minorities, and I empathize with them. And the fact of the matter is that um, we are our own people, for better or for worse. And I think that takes a very mature professional person to recognize that and say, what I'm doing is not being as beneficial as I know it should be. And
And
I really respect you for having that perspective and being able to own that, and not feel like that's a detriment per se, but that it's
hmm
just different. And that's the
yeah,
impression that I got from what you were saying.
yeah,
Not that,
yeah,
not this
yeah.
feeling
It
of
was
white guilt or anything, but this feeling of
right.
my patrons, my students, my teachers, they
Yeah,
need somebody better than me, and
yeah,
that's an
yeah.
admirable thing for you to have.
It was a really hard thing to put out there, to admit and to
Hmm.
accept, because I lived for what I do. I mean, I lived for those kids. They were like
Right.
they were my life, and our staff as well. And I never wanted to do wrong by them. But what I realized was, in all my efforts to do right by them, I wasn't exactly meeting their needs. Although I was learning a lot, I learned a heck of a lot, and I grew a whole lot. Um, the reality was that I wasn't able to support their growth, and in the way that it should have been,
Yeah.
and I did. I learned a lot about myself, and I did learn a lot about race and class and how that affects public education, or education in general, and for us to stick our head in the sand and think that it's just about Common Core, or it's just about high stakes testing, when in
Yeah.
fact we're talking about communities that are stricken by poverty. We're talking about systems that don't place value on the sociocultural experiences that our kids have and bring to school with them. We don't tap into those things. That's where we need to be focusing our time and our energy. Don't get me wrong. I'm not bashing standards or whatever, but that's not going to fix it. That's not going to bridge
Yeah.
the gap until we realize that we as a system are antiquated and are disconnected from like what the real world is. When you get a job, people tap into your personal strengths and experiences. Yet when we bring kids to school, we try to make them fit in this little box. Like they all need to be able to read this way and write that way and test this way.
Hmm.
And it's almost like discongruent to what the world expects of them. And so that's a challenge. That definitely, at that time I didn't realize that, but that was a part of my internal sort of dilemma, was what's going on, like what are we doing, and so
Yeah.
I'm very fortunate in my studies at Penn right now, my doctoral studies. We've talked a lot about student voice, and about tapping into student experience, and not just looking at the traditional academic skill set that we think is what we should be focusing on in school, because we do have kids who they could tell you about how to create a recipe from scratch because they grew up with their grandma who taught them how to cook, and that's important. Or they could tell you about the fact that they immigrated to this country, and gave up everything in their country to be here, and that's important. That shapes who they are. So they may not be able to infer something from
Hmm.
a passage right away, but they could tell you a whole lot that you should be inferring about. So those are
Right.
things that have really shaped the way that I think and that I lead. And so yeah.
So how are you doing
So yeah, yeah,
some of those things right now at your current school? How are you implementing those things you're currently learning? Give
yeah.
me an example of that.
So So I will tell you, just to bridge the little gap. I went from
Okay.
Valley Stream to where I am now in Jericho, at Kaniag Elementary School, and this is my sixth year here as the lead learner. I don't call myself the principal because I feel like there's a demonstrative difference between the two. And I thank people like Joe Mazza and Jessica Johnson and Melinda Miller and Amber Tiemann and Kurt Reese. The list can go on, who have inspired me to see that. There's a difference between someone who's a lead learner, Tom Whitford and Todd Whitaker, and anyway, I can go on. But
Yeah.
I've been here for 6 years. Um, it has been amazing, and I think the one thing everyone will tell you, from our staff to our community to our kids, is that the thing that's at the center for me are our kids
Hmm.
and what their experiences are and what their needs are and what their strengths are. Every kid has a different readiness level, and we just have to give them an entry point for wherever that is. And it may look different in math than it looks in reading, and it may look different in science than it does in social studies. But we try very hard to personalize and individualize learning for our kids, and it's hard. It's a lot of work. And we do a lot to give voice to them. So we shifted in my time here from a very sort of traditional writing approach to a more writer's workshop where we give kids voice and they have writer's notebooks so they can write about their experiences and their feelings and their take on life, and that's rich, and that's important. So that's one example of something I feel like we've done differently here, that taps to our kids. And our kids, I think, if you came here and talked to them, I think they would tell you they know that, like, I love them, and everyone loves them. Like, it's a student-centered building. We are a student-centered community, kid-centered, not just student. I don't just see them as these learners, although they are learners. They are these incredible human beings who just, they just fill the building with like greatness. They're awesome. So,
Yeah,
so
that's
yeah,
awesome.
that's I guess one example.
So you choose to call yourself a lead learner. That's not a district imposed. The
Yeah,
district calls you a principal, and you call yourself a lead learner. That's
yeah,
pretty
yeah, yeah.
cool.
You
Tell me a little
think
more
about
about
think
that.
think about what you think for a moment. Like, and I talk when I do like presentations or workshops or whatever. I tell people, think about the word principal. What do you envision, right? With principal, you envision that person who's dealing with discipline problems. You envision that person who is in their office. You envision some old person that's disconnected from learning. That's a manager. That's an administrator. That's a paper pusher. And I can show you my desk, but I won't because it's a mess. Because I don't spend time doing that kind of stuff. I feel like if we're going to grow as an organization, as a learning community, then I have to model that. I have to be the lead learner, right? Like, we're all learners here. And so I have to sort of try to lead. And it's not just me leading, because I'm not the leader all the time of the learning. Very much our staff leads and our kids lead it. But I'm constantly learning and I'm constantly pushing myself out of my comfort zone, whether through Twitter, whether through the connections I've established on Twitter, whether through my doctoral studies, whether through my dissertation, whatever the case may be. Every day I can genuinely say I go home and I've learned something new, from my kids, from our staff, and sometimes that's a little stressful for people around me because they're like, dude, do you ever turn off? Like, is it ever? Where's the off switch? But that's just the way that I'm wired, and I love it. I love being pushed out of my comfort zone. I love stretching my thinking. I don't know if you follow Peter DeWitt on Twitter, but Peter is a principal here in New York State. He's on a leave right now. He talks a lot about stretching your thinking and being pushed out of your comfort zone. I read his blog regularly because it does that for me. So that's another like place for me where I feel like I'm a lead learner. I read. I mean, granted, I don't read as many books for pleasure as I should because of the doctoral studies, but I read blogs for pleasure and I forward them and I share them and I, link them to emails and whatever. So I'm writing, I blog, right? So I reflect on my experiences because we want kids to be readers and writers, right? We want our staff to be readers and writers and to embody those things. So I try to model those things. So I try to lead in those areas, but to just be a learner. So that's why I call myself that. And actually, Pernil Rip wrote a post recently, and she was like, she criticized the title of lead learner a little bit. Not so much criticized, but forced me to look at it a different way. I don't necessarily see myself. For me, lead learner is not so much about the word lead as it is about learner, and so, and again, I'm not the one who's always leading the learning because our staff might lead a faculty gathering, they might share something via email, they might walk next door and share something. Our kids might be spotlighted. So it's not just me. But because I'm the principal and because I'm the lead learner, I may have to organize some stuff and, bring it together. So maybe that is the leadership part of it. But yeah.
Thank you so much for downloading and listening to this podcast. Please subscribe in iTunes or Stitcher, and please feel free to give us a rating on Stitcher Radio or on iTunes so that we can help spread the word about how much we're learning in this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Jethro Jones.